Good afternoon and welcome to the launch of Swedish Perspectives on Industrial Policy, the Washington Consensus and beyond. Very good to have you all here, both live in the audience as well as online with us. Very welcome. My name is Johan Eklund. I'm the Managing Director of Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum and I'm Professor of Economics. Each year, around this time of the year, we launch a report focusing on what we believe is a relevant economic policy area with implications for policy development and politics in Sweden. And today, this year it's the 13th consecutive year that we launched this report. It's available both online as PDF, but it's also available as a physical paperback. I will be moderating this seminar, and I'm very happy to say we have a very distinguished group of scholars making contributions to this report. And we are in total 12 authors. I'm one of the co-editors together with Enrico Diacco and Martin Andersson. Enrico is the research director at Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum and Martin is a professor of economics. And I will present the other authors as we go along today. Unfortunately, it's a very extensive report. It's close to 200 pages and 8 different chapters that covers a broad set of topics within industrial policy from different perspectives. So we won't be able to go through all the chapters here today, but we will arrange at least 2 more seminars beginning next year focusing on the topics that we leave aside today. Few words about both our panelists and the participants. We have Anna Almqvist, who is at the Confederation of Swedish Trade Unions, economist there. She will be participating in the panel, and I'm sure we will have a lively discussion on interpretations of the Washington Consensus. Martin Andersson is not joining us today, but he is one of the co-editors. Then we have David Castellani, who is a professor of international business at Henley Business School. He has an extensive and well-cited research on firms' internationalization choices, innovation, technology, and economic performance across regions, firms, and countries. Then we have Nina Černić, who is working at the Institute for Economic Research in Munich, the Center for Industrial Organization. She is writing a chapter and contributing with a chapter on lessons on the German debate and policy discussion on industrial policy and the implications for Sweden. She has also been an advisor to the German federal government. Then we have Philip McCann, who is a professor of urban and regional economics at the University of Sheffield. Among a number of distinguished research contributions, he has also served as the special advisor to 2 different European commissioners and advising on regional policy and urban policy. Then we have Enrico, I mentioned. We have Bo-Erik Pers at the Jernkontoret. I've been told that Jernkontoret needs no further introduction in English, but it is the Swedish Steel Association, and he will be participating in the panel discussion. Then we have Fredrik Sjöholm, who is a professor of economics and managing director of Research Institutes of Industrial Economics here in Stockholm. I believe I covered all participants. Some participants shown on pictures here will not appear in the panel discussion, so you can read all their biographies at the end of the report. With those introductory remarks, I would like to hand over to my colleague Enrico Diacco, who will give the introduction on the main conclusions of the report. The floor is yours, Enrico.
Thank you, Enrico Diacco. I have a fellow Italians. We're at least 2 Italians here. That's good. Good to know, I guess. So my job here is basically to line up some of the themes that have emerged during the book here. And then say a little about the conclusions as well in 10 minutes. So I have to, speak extremely fast here. The storyline of the book goes something like this. So in the past, 70s and 80s, so most countries had some kind of industrial policies, either, with tariffs or with picking winners was, the way it was actually framed. But basically, it was not viewed as a very successful, it leading to distorted market mechanism and so forth. Then the Washington Consensus came in the 90s, rejecting industrial policy basically as an instrument to achieve growth, and said, we are favoring macroeconomic stability and efficient market basically. So thus, for many, many years, industrial policy was more or less taboo, at least among economists. The policy that shall not be named was someone saying actually about industrial policy. However, industrial policy has risen on the agenda again. It's discussed in policy circles and even among academics. So the purpose of the book, when we started to think about this, was basically to assess this new interest. So why has it come up on the agenda? What are the motives? How does it differ compared to the old industrial policy logic? And what are the pros and cons of industrial policy? What does history say? And what does basically new evidence of IP fair? So the book reflects on the past, on the present, and the future, and is not, very specific in terms of policy conclusions. We wanted to have a discussion about these things rather than come up with specific policy conclusions beyond Washington Consensus. So, the chapters then. I'll go through extremely quickly. I can look there exactly now. So, the first chapter is by the editors. And then we have a chapter on Germany. The German have had a very intense debate about industrial policy, and they sooner will Nina Czernik go over that type of debate. Then we have Philip McGann, who's actually presenting a new type of industrial policy called smart specialization, which is you can say it's basically a new way to thinking about industrial policy. What do we have more? I have to, see it like that. We have two chapters on the effectiveness of industrial policy. One by Åsa Hansson, who's looking at basically at tax subsidies to activities and industries, which has not been done before. So it's quite a novel report. Then we have a chapter also from Christian Sandström that is looking at one thing on collaboration as a tool of industrial policy, where he discusses the pros and cons of collaboration. And then we have two chapters on foreign direct investments, and by Fredrik Sjöholm and also by Davide Castellani. And then we end with a chapter by me and Christer Ljungvall. We are looking at geopolitics and the rise of China and the use of industrial policy and how we should actually tackle that, basically, that geopolitical conflict that has have risen. So that was the chapter. Okay. I've been speaking about old and new industrial policy. And here is basically two definitions. So the old one is rooted in classical market failures, so economies of scale and externalities and other market failures. And so it's justified intervention by taxes or subsidies. And a very clinical approach. There's a market failure, and you look at it, and how can the state basically intervene? The new one is much broader, the new type of industrial policy. So it's a bit away from market failure, more on creating and shaping markets. It is much more geared to innovation, transition, and support industries to upgrade, basically. Perhaps it has been debated whether this type of industrial policy should actually be named industrial policy. So Roderick, one that has working quite a lot with industrial policy issues, he said maybe we should call it structural transformation or even innovation policy. So there's a lot of definitions about this. Okay, so these are the different narratives, and the different chapters try to look at that from the different logic, and also on the pro and cons of different industrial policies, old and new, basically. So 3 observations emerge, and they are on this picture here, basically. So, on motives, why has the interest of industrial policy risen, basically? So there are 4 or 5 or 6 large ones. So the financial crisis in 2008 was a major cause behind industrial policy. So questioning the role of markets, we need much more of state intervention in different aspects. Then we have the IT boom, basically, disrupting technologies. And how can we speed and help that transition? Then we have green transition, of course, and directed research and moonshots and mission programs was basically one way of doing industrial policy in that. And then lastly, we have this geopolitical, China is on the rise, basically, and with a very aggressive industrial policy, both on large subsidies and also, of course, cutting out investment in certain technologies in China. So these are the motives. So the new industrial policy have some features like, for instance, it's not targeted, maximize synergies with other partial policies, competition policies, innovation policies, R&D policies, tax policies, and so forth. Societal goals should be paramount, beyond market failure, so it's a much broader view of looking at that. Collaboration between state and industry is promoted and said is important. So the overall goal, as someone actually wrote, was engineering an appropriate institutional setting. So that's what some of the motives and some of the aspects that they want to actually do. You can quarrel about these things, of course, which is done in the chapters. And with these very high ambitions of industrial policy. You can also devise new industrial policies, which Philip McCann will discuss a little about that. But there is a quarrel. On quarrel, effectiveness of innovation of industrial policy. First, I would say it's very difficult to evaluate. We don't know a lot about in the past how industrial policies have fared. Here we think we should need a much more of evaluation in order to actually say whether it's good or bad. Some evaluation has been done, and basically what they show is either positive but very often non-significant actually aspects of the policies. Directed technical change was one thing that comes out in the new industrial policy. So very large research subsidies to green transition has been proposed, sometimes under the umbrella of moonshot policies and so forth. But looking back in history, and not ancient history, but the last 10 years, we can see a lot of different types of, perhaps not failures, but at least policies that have not been cost efficient or being additional to have a high additionality. We have, for instance, ethanol, the ethanol project in Sweden. You can quarrel about that, but whether we don't have that. Was that a failure or not? Lots of money went into that. Industriklivet and Klimatklivet, 2 large projects that has been evaluated by Konjunkturinstitutet, and they say, I'm very critical about that. So, again, effectiveness is a little is not always evident. So, the new policies have very high ambitions given the broader motives. So one question I think one should actually discuss is, should it be more effective this time? I think that would come up basically in our discussion. One thing more on Washington Consensus. So a lot of you, of course, know that EU launched a paper with a very activist intervention policies in 2019. It was an activist agenda, national champions, self-reliance, fostering specific ecosystems, tough competition policies, and so forth. The discussion in Germany and France have also been very intense. It was also discussed in that area with very specific industrial policies. It was heavily criticized, and Nina will talk a little more about that. But somehow it started and landed in framework condition as a very, very important aspect. And I think that's one way to say that there has been some awareness that industrial policies may be on the rise again, but framework condition is something to actually look at in more detail. I have one more slide, and I think that's okay. 10 minutes. Can I take that? 1 minute?
Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Policy issues here. So I think there are a number of good reasons of doing actually industrial policies, but one should be actually a little skeptical to its effectiveness. There's very little evaluation that have been showing that industrial policy is a good way to actually do things. For instance, in the debate in a journal just a week ago, there were 2 articles actually saying something about South Korean industrial policy, which is sometimes said is a good way of actually doing industrial policy. One was very positive and one was very negative. So may I be a little more boring here and say perhaps we need more research about that, definitely. On the margin, of course, locally and carefully designed policy like smart policies may be an avenue to actually go further, and that is being done at least in many EU countries. But I would say test and experiment much more before scaling up. This is seldom done when it comes to industrial policy, at least in Sweden. Then cooperation is a buzzword. It was actually in the last research bill, it was said, they coined the concept 133 times. But collaboration has both cost and actually benefits. Change and conflict is still, I think, the essence when it comes to structural adjustment. There are a lot of large programs initiated. We'll see in Sweden in green transition, we will really see what they will actually give. The last question, is Washington Consensus out of fashion? I think I can speak with all the editors. We don't think so, basically. Not everything was good, but who would say that open market, trade openness, macroeconomic stability is bad things, which was the essence of Washington Consensus. So, lastly, I'm sure some of these rather broad statements that I've done here will be qualified and nuanced in the discussion and in the following presentations. So, thank you.
Thank you, Enrico. That was a good spark for a discussion later on, and you will join us in the panel. Yes. So let's move forward, and thank you very much. So next, and now I'm hoping that the technology is with us and I'm looking in the correct camera. Nina Černić, you're going to present a chapter on Germany and emphasize the implications for lessons to be learned for Sweden. Thank you for joining us.
So thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to this great report, and also for giving me the opportunity to present our chapter today. I'm sorry I can't be there in live, but I think you have me in larger than live on the screen. So I will quickly give a brief summary of the discussion of industrial policy in Germany. And as Enrico already mentioned, there are a couple of major challenges that are causing substantial structural change. And these are the digital transformation that is fundamentally changing the economy. It affects production processes, global value chain, and it enables new digital business models like Amazon, Airbnb, Uber, and they have disruptive effects on entire markets. Then there is the decarbonization that is especially important for industries that currently still cause high emissions, such as the steel industry or the mobility sector. But not only these sectors, also related industry like electricity infrastructure. And then, of course, there is the economic rise of China, and the Chinese companies are increasingly present in global markets. And this is a perfectly normal development for an emergency country, but in the case of China, the Chinese companies are supported by the state and receive substantial subsidies, and this causes unfair competition between Chinese and European companies. And what's more, the access to the Chinese market is heavily regulated, and European companies do not have the same opportunities in China as Chinese companies have in Europe. And these developments have led to calls for more active industrial policy. And in Germany, in February 2019, the German Minister of Economic Affairs presented a draft for a new industrial policy called Made in Germany 2030 that included a rather active policy approach. And the draft was heavily criticized, and, spoiler alert, not much of the original active measures were included in the final version that is now published. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I will give an overview of the discussion in Germany, the different arguments that were brought forward, and the main takeaway that other countries might take from our discussion. So I'll give an overview of the central points of the proposed policy and the main critique. So one of the core points was the demand to increase the share of industry in gross value added to 25% in Germany and 20% in Europe, based on the idea that German success was in the past based on its strong industry. But it's important to notice that it's not decisive to which sector a company belongs, but whether the respective jobs generate high value added, productivity, and therefore high wages. And if this is where you want to go to, you should directly target this by investing in skills of the workforce, and it is not achieved by increasing the share of manufacturing. It's important. It's not a sector that is important here. Then another claim was that if all parts of a value chain were integrated into one economic area, a geographic area, the chain would become more resilient. But also this is a fallacy, because the International Division of Labor has contributed significantly to Europe's competitiveness and the high level of prosperity. And an increase in trade costs would substantially decrease real income in Germany. And two colleagues here from IFO have done some calculations, and they assume what would happen if trade costs all over the world would increase by 100%. This would lead to a decrease in real income in Germany by 20%. You might imagine that for similar countries with a similar industrial structure and open economy, the effects might be of a similar magnitude. To increase the resilience of supply chain, diversification is key. We can also see this in the past, and this is also where companies are going. We did here at IFO a survey of 5,000 German companies, and only 10% of them stated that they plan to rely more on domestic supply chains. The huge majorities, they are going towards more diversification of their supply chains. So policy makers should rather work towards reducing trade costs and through trade agreements, rather than advising companies to build closed value chains. Another aspect was that it was demanded that there is a need for EU to change the EU competition law to promote national and European champions. This was certainly inspired by the prevented merger between Siemens and Alstom, the railway sections, to create a competitor to the state-owned Chinese CRRC railway company. But what is important is to note that size is not synonymous with competitiveness or innovativeness, and a European champion is usually good for that company, but not necessarily for the local market and consumers. And there is also no need to change the law because European merger control does allow the emergence of European or national champions if a merger involves sufficiently strong synergies and complementaries. But this was just not the case in this case, and policymakers or politicians should not interfere here. Then there was the demand that the state should prevent the takeover of German companies by foreign buyers. There was the idea that there should be a special facility for that so that the state could buy a company. But the problem is not the takeover of European companies by foreign investors. It is problematic that European companies do not have the same opportunities to invest in Chinese company, and one should rather tackle this problem than closing off the European market. More sensible is the idea to have a European screening for foreign direct investment in critical infrastructure and technologies. We're talking about electricity, communication networks, water supply, etc. But it must be based on clear, predefined criteria that are independent of political influence. So after the discussion, there was at the end of the year, there was the final final version of the strategy was published. And as I said before, there is not much active industrial policy left. It consists of 3 pillars. The first one is improving framework conditions for Germany as an industrial location, and it includes aspects from various fields of economic policy, such as reform corporate taxation, have a more flexible labor market, improve infrastructure, reduce bureaucracy, which is all fair points, but it's not real industrial policy. The second pillar is strengthening new technologies and mobilizing private capital. And here the focus is on so-called game changer technologies that have the potential to create new markets or have disruptive effects like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nanotechnology. And here the points are increasing private investment, exploit the potential of digitalization, advance the mobility of the future, and to support new technologies for low emission production. All these points are not specified in more detail. So this is it's basically still quite vague. And then the third pillar is not less vague. It says safeguarding technological sovereignty and to avoid losses of know-how and maintain self-determination in central technological fields. There has recently been an initiative by the German Ministry of Research and Education regarding technological sovereignty. And it's quite an interesting idea or definition they propose. It's the ability to cooperatively co-shape key technologies and technology-based innovations. So here the idea is not that Germany has to be able to produce independently every new technology, but to shape the development and to coordinate standards in a way that Germany can use the potential of the technologies. There's been founded a council which has just come into place, and we'll see what comes out of it. But it might be an interesting approach. So, I think we can take away that active industrial policy is not really the way to move forward, but still the changes of structural change remain. And so how can they successfully be addressed and mastered? And I will say something about four points here. The first is, the big question is how to deal with China. And one thing you have to be aware when thinking about this is that you have to distinguish between countries at the technological frontier and the countries behind it. It's according to the growth theory by Aguillon and Howard. And the point is that countries at the global technological frontier, like Germany or Sweden, they can only grow through innovation and thereby pushing global technological frontier. And for these countries, competition, openness to technology, protection of intellectual property rights, and having excellent universities and research institutions is crucial. On the other hand, countries behind the technological frontier, they can grow also through imitation. That means copying and adapting existing technologies, and in this way they can learn and catch up with technology leaders. And these countries can profit from a much more active industrial policies because they know what arrows, for example, because they can restrict their market access to protect domestic firms from competition, from more advanced firms, etc. So this is why it does not make sense for countries at the technological frontier to copy Chinese industrial policy, but every country has to assess what is the right policy for them. And then two principles should guide interactions and negotiations with China. One is coordination at the European level to leverage the size of the EU internal market. What is a bit problematic here is that China is currently creating a network of bilateral agreements with individual EU countries, and this might have far-reaching implications for the EU, as the ability of member states to take a common political position might be challenged. Second principle is reciprocity and focus on open markets rather than increased trade investment barriers. Another point is that with digitalization and new digital business models, we need to adapt the competition law. The background is that with these digital platforms, they exhibited large networks and effects and gravitate towards monopolies. What is important here is to enable authorities to take actions against the imminent market power of digital companies to avoid a tipping of the market. And there has been an adoption of the amendment of the competition law in Germany at the beginning of this year to exactly do this, because in the past, the authorities always had to wait for a market power to arise, and then they could sanction it. But now this is really a fundamental change. They can assess whether there is imminent market power, and they can stop before the market tips. For example, they can order the data access to potential competitors, as a lot of these models are data-based, and really access to data is crucial. So another point is how to promote future key technologies. And here again, we have to distinguish between countries at the technology frontier and the ones behind. And for countries at the technology frontier, it is difficult to identify what are the future technologies. It's just, and politicians for sure cannot do this. So the process should be left to researchers and companies. And one way to do this is via mission orientations. This was also mentioned here before. So the idea is then to define a goal or a problem to be solved. For example, reduce carbon emissions by X%, but not to give a path how to do it. Do it via e-mobility, or just to leave the technology open, and to just define the aim and let there be a competition or a challenge which technology will win. And finally, it's important to shape structural change and to coordinate at the European level. First is structural change happens. It will all happen. It has always happened. And it is important not to inhibit it, but to shape it, and to create policies that enable the gains of structural change and to allow as many as possible to participate in these gains and mitigate the effect on those who are negatively affected. this is a task at the international and European level, because the phenomena that digitalization, decarbonization, rise of China are global phenomena, and they cannot be solved by a single country, not by Germany or Sweden. So there's coordination in R&D or negotiations of trade and investment agreements needed. And I think one of the main takeaways really is that you should address the problems with the instruments of the economic field they are attributable to. So if there is a problem in the field of trade economics or innovation economics, use the tools from this field and not call for industrial policy. Be rather skeptical and stay with really look at the underlying question or underlying problem and what is the most direct way to solve it, instead of calling for active industrial policy. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions and the discussion later, and I'm also excited about all the other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation on a very interesting chapter. I believe it will help to inform the policy debate here in Sweden. You will participate in a panel discussion, but two quick follow-up questions to you. The second question, I believe, is a difficult one, but I'll ask it nevertheless. First, is it a fair description to say that the revised version of the German industrial policy is roughly equivalent to reversal back to the original ideas of the Washington Consensus? Can you push it that far? So that's the first question. And then you mentioned the three drivers, major drivers of structural change: digitalization, decarbonization, and rise of China, I think was the word used by Enrico. I believe that the panel will talk about quite a lot about mission-oriented structural change, and also coming back to your points on China. But looking at the digital market and the point you made in reassuring competition in the digital market, and an earlier point you made on free of political influence, and here is the potentially tricky question: would you say that the Digital Market Act and the Digital Service Act, now coming out as a proposal from the Commission, is a appropriate way forward? Recognize it's a difficult one to address, but I'm struggling myself to get to wrap my head around this issue. You want to address these questions, or yes, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. To your first questions, I think I'd actually say yes. It is a lot about framework conditions, about really immigration, about open markets, technology openness. Yes, and when it doesn't have so much macroeconomic at some points, it's not as complete maybe, but I'd say, okay, for sure, yes. Point for this, your second question, I have to admit that I haven't seen the paper, and I don't know exactly what they were suggesting, but I do agree that overall it is a very tricky problem for authorities to tackle the problem when there is a threat of market power, and it is a very difficult.
Yeah, it defies the traditional definitions in antitrust policies and the conventional way of thinking, I believe. But I'm sure we'll come back to that discussion in future seminars. Again, thank you very much, Nina. You will join us again in a few minutes when we have the panel discussion. But now, swiftly over to Philip McCann, who's give a presentation on modern place-based industrial policy. Philip, floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to the launch, and it's been a really good experience to be part of the process of putting this report together, which I certainly recommend to people. I think it's a tremendous report covering many, many different fields, and I think it's extremely topical and very, very timely, and also a report that really spans countries, different parts of the world, thinking about these kind of challenges. So the report's terrific. In terms of the contribution of the report, that the chapter written by Raquel Ortega-Argiles and myself, what we've done is we've chosen to examine different aspects of how people are thinking about industrial policy and also acting in a sense in a modern industrial policy type of framework along the lines that Enrico outlined earlier, the kind of Roderick type of approach. There are different things taking place in different parts of the world, and these different actions and interventions and ways of trying to design and deliver policy also face lots of different challenges. And these challenges are not specific to industrial policy. If you take framework conditions, they also face challenges, because the question is, what are we trying to achieve and where do we want society to get to? So if we start off just thinking about, obviously in the period of the Washington Consensus, we've already heard from the introduction from Enrico, the idea that kind of framework approaches, the horizontal settings, making sure competition policies well designed, regulatory systems are well articulated. Those are the main features. Enforcement of contracts, and also building in economic analysis in terms of how competition policy was being designed and enforced. These are basically the pillars, and those things haven't gone away. They're still there very much in terms of competition and markets authorities in many, many countries. Those principles are still very much enshrined, and they provide underpinnings of how we conduct most of our policy settings. Having said that, there are shifts which are taking place in different contexts. And those shifts are in some sense regarding concerns of societal outcomes associated with the kind of framework conditions that were dominant in most countries, in industrialized countries. And four things that we would highlight here. One of them is technological changes. We are facing a new generation of technologies. People talk about artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, these kinds of areas. But these are very real. These changes are widespread, they're on an enormous scale, and they are increasingly speeding up. And more aspects of our societies are facing the onset and the advent of these technologies, and that creates a lot of uncertainty and instability. A second one, of course, and in some ways the biggest issue we face, of course, is the environmental challenge of climate change mitigation. Obviously, COP26 has been dominating many of our news headlines recently, but these are obviously long-term, ongoing challenges. There's been a lot of reflection and thinking about them over the last couple of decades, but these things are going to continue. And in many cases, in many arenas, there's been a sense that the kind of Washington Consensus type approach, while it's helped societies move forward on many, many fronts, there's no question about that, hasn't particularly helped us to get into a space which is productive and conducive for bringing about the kinds of changes that we need. Of course, the environmental one is an obvious one. It's not simply a matter of market failures. These are system-wide issues. And again, if we talk about new forms of technologies, it's not just a kind of a market failure type of problem that would be in a standard industrial organization textbook. These systemic issues go much further than market failure types of arguments. And the kind of analysis, the kind of data that we would typically use to think about those challenges often doesn't get us very far when trying to address these much bigger system-wide or systemic, as people might call them, types of challenges. So this has led to a change of thinking in many areas, including within economics. And some of the top economists in the world are thinking very clearly and explicitly explicitly along these lines. Part of the issue that people start to think about again is that there are many cases where governments, or government, whichever, may need to be part of the solution. That simply having well-designed regulatory and competition policies and then letting the market do the rest actually doesn't necessarily get us where we need to get to. Of course, the climate change one is the most obvious one there. But one of the issues which is also surfaced in many countries, in particular where I am in the UK, in recent years, but it's not just confined to the UK at all, is the question of place, regions, localities. The 2016 particularly, the Brexit vote, the Trump election in the United States, the referenda in Italy, the Renzi referenda, the Van der Bellen-Hofen referenda in Austria. You see examples such as the Gilets jaunes and so on. There's been increasing political instability in many countries associated with localities, and the sense that parts of countries, it's not just differences between countries, but within countries, there's a certain fracturing being taken place over the last couple of decades, that parts of countries have tended to benefit from and enjoy the benefits of growth and development, whereas other parts of those same countries have increasingly been left behind. Now, this is not a universal story. This kind of interregional divergence type phenomenon is approximately 45-50% of OECD countries. But the scale of those divergences in some countries is really dramatic, and the UK is an obvious case. And that changes political narratives because people start asking questions. Hang on, what is government for? I don't mean a particular government or a particular political party, but asking questions about what is government and what is governance for? Because if the winners from modern development are always the same groups in the same places, then actually what starts to happen is that starts to undermine the very governance systems that we want to be working well. And this is something, again, which is not about market failure. They're much more system-wide systemic problems. They're what sociologists often call wicked problems. It's very hard to think about them by analysing any one aspect in just one particular dimension. And these shifts in thinking, I mean, you've quoted Roderick, who's probably, of the mainstream economists at the very, very top of their profession, he's probably the person who was the first one to articulate these issues very seriously. Stiglitz would be another. But since then, there's many, many people thinking very seriously. People like Sir Tim Besley, Paul Collier. I mean, some of the top economists in the world are thinking about these things extremely carefully. So there's a few examples that we highlight in our chapter. It's not meant to be exclusive. It's just to give a flavour for different dimensions of this. So one of them is this shift in terms of thinking about places. This idea of partitioning in countries. In the case of countries like the United States, particularly the UK, these interregional inequalities are enormous. I mean, at the moment, the UK, if you look at the OECD TL3 areas, the small unit areas, the productivity prosperity variations within the UK are about the same as the whole of the Eurozone. These are dramatic differences, even in a relatively small country. And those differences are reflected in issues such as not only wages and incomes, quality of housing, but also things like educational attainment, social mobility, access to higher education, but then access to healthcare, most importantly, longevity and quality of life. So parts of the UK will have quality of life, which is really in the very top echelons of the OECD countries, and other parts of the country 2 hours away or even less would have quality of life lower than somewhere like Alabama in the United States. These are dramatic variations, and of course, they lead to profound shocks to institutional systems and people's sense of participation and engagement in socio-political affairs. What's my role? What's my contribution to society? So one of the areas is the notion of place-based policy. Of course, this has been something which has been heavily debated in the European Union, European Commission, regional and urban policy, and so on. up until around the time of the global financial crisis, regional policy was extraordinarily marginal in most countries. Tiny type of policy, because most policy was simply deregulate, have good competition policy, and just let the market decide where companies want to invest, where they want to locate, and so on. And actually, that was also the policy argument advocated by organizations such as the World Bank, use what's called a space-blind policy, place blind or space-blind. So don't prioritize any particular area, just have good institutional settings and let the market decide everything else. Part of that thinking was on the assumption if you have concentration of activity in certain places tend to generate more prosperity, productivity, that eventually those things will start to equalize over time. And of course, there's a very large literature in economics that argues that exactly these things will happen. The problem is in many countries, that is not what happened. Those processes started to become more and more cumulative. And it's this divergence phenomenon which has led to fundamental questions being asked. And actually, as we document in the chapter, this led to very, very high-level debates between analysts in the World Bank, the OECD, the European Commission, and in different institutions worldwide. I myself was part of those discussions. And out of that came an argument that there was a place-based argument for policy, not in every setting, not in every issue, not in every context, but there were fundamental arguments where place-specific, place-sensitive, place-based policy did have a role. So one of the things we do in the chapter, we articulate the smart specialization agenda of the European Union to explain that as a kind of a modern industrial policy way of thinking, where what you're doing is you're trying to combine kind of top-down directionality, mission-oriented, sometimes people call it these kind of things, with bottom-up, locally designed and delivery systems. So basically, you're trying to reconcile bottom-up with top-down in some sense, rather than simply horizontal. So you still provide framework conditions, but you also try to instill a combination of both top-down directionality and bottom-up policy design and delivery. And this argument actually has now taken a new step forward, and it's regarding the question of climate change. So if you think about the European Union, the policy called the Green Deal, how do you implement a Green Deal? You can't simply build lots of windmills, you can't build lots of gigafactories. That's not just of itself going to solve the problem. What you've got to do is incentivize numerous stakeholders in many different settings to engage with developing policies and innovations aimed at promoting climate change mitigation. So one of the things we explain is the rationale behind that actually the kind of place-based approach provides a solid way forward to think about this. And just finally, we also highlight a few other cases which are also evident in many countries. One is around the use of public procurement to drive industrial policy, particularly innovation-led activities. That public procurement is being used in different countries in different ways. That's another angle to this. And then the final part of the chapter, we also highlight the ambiguities. Again, we come back to the UK case, because the ambiguities between what is place-based versus sectoral, what is genuinely spatial in some sense versus what is largely top-down. There are many cases where these issues are actually ambiguous intellectually, conceptually, as well as empirically, and that challenges us to kind of take a step back and think about these issues very carefully again. And this is particularly important now even more, both with the climate change agenda and also the potential asymmetry of the shocks associated with the COVID pandemic in different places. So that's broadly how we kind of think about these things. And I think I'll just stop there and hand back over.
Thank you very much, Philip. A very brief follow-up question to you. I find the discussion, what you're saying about we're not dealing with conventional market failures, we're not dealing with the conventional answers that economics provides us, but we have wicked problems, as you call it, and we have systemic issues here. Now my question is, sometimes I get confused by the discussions I hear in policy circles here in Stockholm, where personally, I am of the opinion that these wicked problems nevertheless can be addressed with the conventional toolbox of economics. Some argue otherwise. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I'm an economist, so I agree with you. But my view on these issues is that you often have to think across the piece much more carefully. So, for example, many of the issues that wouldn't figure in a regular industrial organization, microeconomics textbook, and, you know, I've taught these things for 2 decades in universities. There'll be many things in those issues that actually have real concrete dimensions to them in real life, but economists would tend not to think about. So I'll give you an example. If you have kind of regional heterogeneity and you have a widening in terms of regional prosperity, you start to get the institutional system itself being undermined in terms of the capacity of government, the incentives for people to work with government, and so on. These are things that don't exist in a textbook on industrial organization or in urban and regional economics. We just talk about growth, dynamics, and some sort of factor price equalization effects. So you have to start introducing also insights from other fields, sociologists, political scientists, and so on. And I think that's the nature of these system-wide problems. I think economics has a huge role to play in here, there's no question. But you also have to think about other issues, maybe in behavioral sciences and so on, that actually give much more color and nuance to how we think about market mechanisms. And as I said, Stiglitz and Roderick were probably the first frontline, top-level economists to start thinking in this way. Amartya Sen would be another, I guess. But this is much more general now. So it's not to say economics doesn't count or it shouldn't be part of the story. It has to be absolutely central to the responses, but we do need to think a lot more broadly in many cases.
Thank you very much. I would love to continue precisely on this conversation, but I will move, thinking about time, I will turn to, stay with us, Philip, and we'll move over to the panel. Anna, welcome up on the stage. Buerik, welcome up on the stage. And Enrico, join us on the stage here.
Where do you want us?
Wherever you, I'll stay in the corner here and you're on the center stage. Anna, we'll begin with you.
Yes.
We've heard some observations from Enrico, and we've heard some remarks on critical drivers of technological and structural change. Do you think it's a fair description, and do you agree with that we should stick with framework conditions, and do you agree with our interpretations of this?
Well, I would say I agree with sticking with framework conditions to some extent, but maybe not exactly the same interpretations. I'm going to start with just saying a few things about how I think about and more generally the Swedish Trade Union Confederation think about industrial policy, because I think sometimes there's a need of a bit of a public service announcement. So obviously we see productivity as central to growth and a cornerstone of employment, of prosperity, and future welfare. So that's why we concern ourselves with industrial policy in some sort of broad regard. You know, we don't have the view that productivity can be achieved by protecting or sheltering specific companies or industries in general because they are not productive enough. I mean, if you look at our how we look at wage policy, wages should increase or follow productivity in the society as a whole. So, you know, the answer to low productivity is not low wages, and in general, the answer is not what you call vertical type industrial policy. So you know, it's a little corny, but we sometimes say that we protect workers, not jobs. But I think it paints the picture. So that being said, growth and productivity is obviously not, it doesn't occur in a vacuum. And the companies, individual companies are not an island. So the state has a very important role, I think, in directing change, and especially when you talk about societal goals and where are we going, where do we want to go. So an important role in sort of promoting skills development, structural change, innovation, new technology. But when we talk about industrial change, it is that broad approach that I think Enrico called the current approach, or the new approach. But to us, that's not particularly new. We've always talked about industrial policy. We've always emphasized skills, education, the macroeconomic framework. So in a way, the world has caught up with the labor movement, right. I think. Yes, I would agree with you that it's the sort of, horizontal industrial policy, sound frameworks, those are the important things and the main role of the state. But I think what's important is what does that entail? What is, what are those sound framework conditions? And the subheading of your report is the Washington Consensus and beyond. And I think we really need to move beyond the Washington Consensus, because we need, not because we need to move towards more vertical industrial policy necessarily, but because we need to rethink those structural, those framework conditions. So just to give an example, so the Washington Consensus obviously it prescribes fiscal policy discipline, avoidance of large fiscal deficits. And while I agree, as has been said here, that stable macroeconomic environment is very important, I think the overemphasis on a low debt during the last few decades has been harmful to growth in a lot of ways. Because creating a strong economy is not just about low debt. It's about full employment, well-functioning infrastructure, healthy, well-educated population, innovative business, good adjustment tools, labor market training, unemployment insurance, and those things require continuous investments, not austerity. So that's just one example, but I think there are several examples where we need to question sort of the prescriptions from the Washington Consensus in that regard. I think I'll stop for there.
Thank you. I'll hand over to Bo Erik, and to the audience here present in the room, LO and the industry and the traditions of consensus and coming together in periods of structural change. But for you, the international audience, I should emphasize it's interesting to have these two individuals on the stage here, because there's a strong tradition in Sweden for the labor union and industry and the business community to come together and actually reach a consensus, as that's sort of the core idea of the Swedish model, very often discussed. Nevertheless, it's my job to kind of trickle out where do you disagree. So
it shouldn't be too hard.
With those words, Bo Erik.
Thank you very much, Johan. Industrial policy is in focus again, that I can conclude. And I have a question mark here, and that is, are we drifting away from Washington Consensus, or are we not? And the reason before that I suspect that perhaps we are doing that is that I think there are there are a lot of different big questions here, but there are two areas that I want to emphasize, and that is ability to mitigate climate change. And then because of that, I do see that there are questions about the increased subsidies of in different countries, even in Europe. And is there really a need of that? That is a question I have. And will that, in that case, affect competitiveness between companies? And what will happen with fair play if that is happening? That is the question I have. But of course, we need also to work with climate change, and we need to do very, very big technology changes, that is for sure. And I represent the steel industry, and as you all know here, I suppose that we are doing a lot in that area. But then also we have geopolitics in this, and that has gives me higher and higher concern, actually, and has been that for many years. And then I'm thinking about China, and especially the Chinese Communist Party and their actions. We know that in China they have huge subsidies, and we can see that in the steel industry. But we can also see, as mentioned here before, a lack of reciprocity. And we don't have the ability to invest in China, but we can see that they are buying into companies in, for instance, Europe. What will that be the result of that in the long run? And on top of that, we have the Belt and Road Initiative. And as many of you understand, it's much more in this than just a logistic and transportation question. It's also, I would say, more or less the Chinese Communist Party takeover strategy, more or less. And they are also influencing opinions worldwide in many, many different areas, even in the cultural area, etc. And that, to me, is very scary. And when we look upon huge subsidies in Chinese companies, for instance, then also it's a big question mark what will happen with free trade and fair trade. It might be. Free trade is, of course, important. We all think so. And it's a small country like Sweden, it's, of course, a necessity for us. Then we can export to all these countries that we are exporting to. In Swedish steel industry, we are exporting to 140, 150 countries over the world. So free trade is, of course, very important for us, but it also has to be a fair trade. And that can be moved, or the balance can be moved by big subsidies. If you look at Swedish industries here, and especially I would say the steel industry, but start with the Swedish industry as a whole, I think it's very high ambitions. And we can see today that we have 22 different climate roadmaps from the Swedish steel industries. And I'm not talking about 22 companies, I'm talking about 22 different industries. I think that is impressive. And I would say that the industry really in Sweden is in the lead, and especially that is regard to the steel industry in Sweden. We started to work with this already 2011. It's 10 years ago. And then we decided upon a new vision for the future, a very strong commitment taken by the industry. And the whole of this, I would say, is market-driven. It's not politically driven. It's totally market-driven. So why are we doing this? Because we have looked upon what is the main trends that we do have in the world. And we believe very much in the climate change is something that we need to address, because you have a very, very big trend in that area. And what we do see today is that all our customers, the big customers and very many of the customers that we have, is very, very interested in what we are doing. And we are driving this very, very quickly forward. And what we are also doing here is that we try to shorten the time span in the ability to give products to the market that are CO2 free. But there are two specific areas here that are very, very important for us to succeed. And here we need help from the government, because this is out of control for us. One area is electricity. When we are moving from coal, we are moving into electricity instead, and oxygen. And we need oxygen in order to reduce the iron ore and take away the oxygen. So hydrogen is something that we really need. I think I said the wrong word there. We need hydrogen. And to produce hydrogen, we need a lot of electricity. And if we take all these climate roadmaps that we have in Sweden, and we try to sum this up together with also the transportation area and so on, then we can see that the need of electricity in Sweden has to double between a really short time period. And we want to increase the speed in what we are doing, because what we are also in the industry, I think the people in the steel industry, are very proud of this development. So we are working very, very hard, and that is done in all levels. Another very, very important area that I also want to emphasize here is competence and the flow of talents into our different areas that we have in the different production sites and so on, and also in the companies. And we need to double that also in a time span of roughly 5 to 10 years. Per year, we need to double the flow of competence, the flow of talents into the specialists into our companies. And that is also something that of course put a very high need on the society and the university, etc., that we can do that. I think that when I read this report, it was a mixed perspective, but I'm really glad to see that this is something that is taken care of here, and we have so much research in these areas. So this is something I look forward to see the following up, and also the how this will continue. That is very important, I think.
Thank you, Bo Erik. We have a few minutes, and I will open if there are any questions from the floor, I will welcome those. And I've also seen Anna, you're intensively taking notes, so I'm sure you have some comments here. And Enrico, we have been talking about a couple of different issues, but we have decarbonization on all things related to that, and we have how to deal with China. So let's talk a bit about China. And you worked with that, you have international experience in that field. And I should say, if you read the report carefully, there are different perspectives on how to deal with China. So Enrico, what is your view?
China is complicated, definitely. And you can speak hours and days about China. I think sometimes we tend to underestimate China's technological capabilities, actually. So it's not a raw material intensive company that suddenly has climbed a bit by using foreign technology and, playing a foul play. In many, many fields, it's actually very technologically competent. And in the same field that Western countries are actually active in, digital fields, AI, and so forth, biotechnology, and so forth. So I think that's, don't underestimate them, basically. There's also a risk, which we write in the chapter, that we in the past, when we invested in China, we were doing basically substitute that what China didn't, was not able to actually achieve and do. But if you look at research, China is very innovative in these fields, and basically they are sometimes on the same level as Western companies. So they are doing that cheaper and with the same quality, and sometimes with a higher quality. So again, don't underestimate it. However, China is complicated, as you already have mentioned, basically, when it comes to IP infringements, access to new market and so forth. So the question is, how should we actually, tackle China? And I'm more in line with Nina, basically. Be hard, don't be naive, but still work with China. Because that's also one thing that happened during the 70s, 80s, 90s. China was extremely important in terms of competitiveness for innovation in the Western countries as well, basically. Van Reenen, one of the top economists like McGann has written quite a lot about that. So I think Nina had two good principles, tackle China, be hard, don't be naive. One way to actually still to I think work with scientific cooperation, even if we know that sometimes China is basically playing a foul play as well. But don't be naive in that. So I would rather go to actually don't close our cooperation with China. Keep an eye open, and scientific diplomacy, scientific cooperation is still, I think, very, very, very valid. And be tough when it comes on investment and so forth, just like Nina said. Was a long answer. Yeah.
So that's okay with long answers. This is complicated issues. Anna, I will give you the last word on this panel, but first give you a chance to trickle out where you disagree with Bo Erik, because I'm sure you do disagree, so tickle us. But not forgetting Philippe and Nina that you're with us. So you've listened to the panel discussion so far. Anything you would like to add or comment on?
Yeah, I think the discussions reflect the fact that these issues are not easy. If it was fairly straightforward, and the kind of Washington consensus had worked out exactly as anticipated, then these discussions wouldn't be taking place. But the world has changed in ways that were unexpected. And also, even at the macro level, macroeconomics. A lot of people thought that by the turn of the present century, macroeconomics, there was nothing else to study. We kind of understood everything, and then we had the global financial crisis. So the way that economists have been operating, both analytically, but also central banks and institutions, everything has been, in a sense, being made up as we go along. It's being practice and experience informing analytics. It's been the other way around often. And I think that these discussions today reflect a lot of these shifts. There's much less certainty about these things than there was 10 years ago, and everybody's struggling with them. And it's not simply forget about framework conditions and competition policy. It's not about that. It's about enforcing IP. All of those things are absolutely central, but there are additional layers of nuance which are complicated. And everybody's kind of trying to struggle and work forward on these things. So.
Thank you. Nina, any comments?
I can only agree here. It is true. It is difficult, new problems, and there are no easy solutions. But my impression is that there is a really good discussions, and we are getting to the problems. And now I forgot what I wanted to say. It is just also, especially what Enrico said with China. It's easy to say we have a trade agreement with China, but like in reality, it's much harder. But that shouldn't stop us from going there, from trying again and again, and working for solutions and creative solutions, and finding ways to move forward.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah,
now you have got a chance.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm not going to talk about things where I disagree, but things where I think we agree quite a lot, me and Bo Erik. I think, obviously, in the report, the issue of climate change, I agree, it's sort of put industrial policy up on the agenda again, and that's something that I think we all realize, and it's being discussed in that regard. And I think it's reasonable that to sort of think about how can we mobilize both public and private resources to meet this challenge, because we need to reduce emissions quickly, and it's a big task that we have in front of us. So I think it's good that we sort of discuss these things. And you say the change is market driven, and I agree in a sense that Swedish companies, and that's I emphasize Swedish because I think it's very different in a lot of other countries, unfortunately, but a lot of Swedish companies have realized that this is, if you are quick, if you are in the forefront, then this is really an opportunity to make money, to put it simply. So yes, it's market driven, not because of, though I don't question genuine climate concern. That's not maybe the main motif. The main motif is, this is a way to this is a competitive edge that we might have. But anyway, I think we have a similar view in terms of the role of the state here. I wouldn't say that the state, there might be a role for the states in some ways in investing in more traditional industrial policy in a few reasons. I wouldn't discard it completely, but I think the main role of the state here is a number of investments in public goods that are necessary to make. Energy infrastructure, as you mentioned, transportation infrastructure, also competency and as you said, it's education, active labor market policies that we really need to invest and make sure that, both because we need to make sure that we have the skills needed, but also to make sure that we are sharing the gains, because we see it as there are gains from this transition. So it's not about sharing the burdens of climate change transition, but sharing the gains. So I think for that part, education and active labor market policy should be a focus for investments. And then another issue that we discussed just beforehand is the need to speed up the permit process for a lot of investments in green technology and to make this transition happen. So I think we're in agreement on a lot of points.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop you there, Bo Erik, because I promised Anna to have the last word in this panel. But you will join us later on in the closing session. So give the panelists and warm hand, and let's move on to the two remaining chapters for today. Focusing on foreign direct investments, and which of course relates to the discussions we've had here on last hour or so. David Castellani, I hope you are online.
Yes, I am. And,
perfect, and we can hear you. So the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to contribute to this very interesting report and for giving me the chance to present and to participate in this presentation and in this debate. So my chapter is more on a narrow industrial policy take. So me and Frederick after me will talk about policy to attract multinational enterprises and foreign direct investments. And I had the great advantage in the book, in the report, to also build on the shoulder of Frederick, that did a great job in highlighting all the range of industrial policies that can be kind of used to attract multinationals and FDI, and I'm sure he will say more about this later. So I will just say, basically, when we think of attracting multinationals, there are mixed views, and some of us might think that attracting multinationals may be a good thing for the country. Others may think that they will not provide so many benefits for many reasons, but there seems to be a consensus that when multinationals come with R&D activities in the country, that tends to be a good thing, both because they employ high-skilled workers, and because this could be externalities or spillovers on the domestic economies. And there's a few studies on Sweden as well that kind of provide evidence in this line. In the chapter, I discuss broader literature showing that this seems to be the case. So if we agree on this, then attracting R&D investments by multinational enterprises are prime targets for industrial policy. So again, here I'm taking a rather narrow view of industrial policy, but what I'm trying to do is, assuming that attracting R&D activities by multinationals is a good thing, and we want to use that lever for industrial policy, How can we do that? And to do that, we need to understand what are the factors that attract R&D investment by multinational enterprises. There's a very huge literature which I try to glance through in the report, in my chapter for the report. And let me highlight a few things which I think are relevant for the discussion. And the first and probably most important thing is, what is the geographical scale of analysis that we have to use when we look at policies to attract R&D investments by multinationals? And I'll argue that the geographical scale is very narrow, is very granular, and R&D investment by multinationals are done in cities or in city regions more than in countries, and that reflects into the type of policies that we can put in place to attract them. I will also argue around the fact that these places in the world that attract multinationals need to be connected to each other. So there's an important thing related to non-local linkages. I will touch upon the issue of whether production and R&D are related, and so to the extent that a country cannot attract production investment by multinationals, or like a country like many advanced countries, including Sweden, have seen multinationals moving production away from their country. How does that reflect on the attractiveness of the country for R&D investments? And then I'll discuss the implication for industrial policy. So the first thing is, the question is, are R&D activities attracted by countries or local characteristics? And the idea is, when firms decide where to locate R&D activities, do they look at Sweden, or do they look at Stockholm, Malmö, or Gothenburg? And the idea is Stockholm competing with other Swedish cities to attract R&D activities by multinationals, or is competing with Berlin, Paris, or London, or Milan? So that is relevant because, of course, the level of intervention changes. And so if we think of the factors that attract R&D activities, let's pick two which are very popular and very important for policy. One is the tax rate, which of course is very important. So countries that have lower tax rate, they tend to attract more investment because it's cheaper to do activities in countries that have lower tax rate. And the other common argument is that we need strong intellectual property rights regimes, because if we attract multinationals, they need to have their technology protected. Well, it turns out, we talked about China, that a lot of multinationals have been doing R&D in China, and China is not known for very strong intellectual property rights, because in fact the literature has found mixed results, mixed evidence on the role of intellectual property rights regimes, and because multinationals have ways to protect their property rights by breaking their knowledge in chunks, so that even if they lose some of the chunks of this knowledge, they don't lose all their competitive advantage. And in fact, that allows multinationals also to locate in countries that have relatively weak intellectual property rights. And tax rate, as I said, it's important, but when you compare the role of tax rate with other local factors like agglomeration economies or the availability of human capital and talents, what is the reduction in tax rate that you need to introduce in your country in order to compensate for the fact that, for example, there's no other firms where you can get some knowledge from, or you don't have talents to draw from the local economy. And what results in the literature suggest is that clearly these factors are much more important in many cases. So the tax rate is certainly important, but if you don't have other local factors, then this country level factors tend to be less effective. And this is even more true when you look at knowledge intensive activities. Because knowledge-intensive activities tend to be very concentrated in a few locations. There's a term that has been used in the literature, which is spiky geography. So the innovation is distributed in very few places. So when you look at I'll show you two very interesting graphs here. And the first one is dated, many years back. It's from Richard Florida. On the left is the number of patents in certain locations in the world. As you can see, that they are very much concentrated in just a few places. And even when you look at the US, you have the same picture. And if you look at Sweden, I didn't have data for Sweden, but it is probably the same thing. So when you look at investing in R&D, when multinationals decide to locate R&D in the US, clearly they are not looking at the Midwest. They're not even looking at Florida or Texas. They're looking at California and the tri-state area, maybe the area around Detroit, Chicago. So it's only a few places that attract investments. And this is looking at regions around the world in a decade ago again. This simply says that if we rank the regions in terms of number of patents, and we take the first 100 regions in terms of patents, this account for 70% of the patents, and they account for just around 20% of population. So basically, patents are very concentrated. Innovation is very concentrated in a few places. And this reflects also where multinationals locate their R&D activities. And here is a map of the world with investments in different cities in the world. And the top part is where manufacturing investments go, and the lower part is where R&D investment go. And the bottom line is that basically, according to this data set, there's investments in roughly 6,500 cities which have received some production investment, and only 1/10 of these cities actually have received R&D investments. And 60% of this investment in R&D are concentrated in just the top 5% of these cities. So the point is that in the chapter I discussed the theoretical reasons for this, but mostly it's because knowledge is tacit, and it's transferred through personal contacts. And so in order to generate innovation, firms have to be next to each other, and this creates areas of excellence which are very concentrated in a few places. And so that means that, again, when you look at R&D investments in the US, there's only a few pockets where you see R&D investments, and they're not clearly dispersed. The implication for this for policy, I will come that in the conclusion, is clearly that you need to go at a very local level in order to create the conditions to attract R&D investments. But these local places, they cannot develop all the knowledge that is required. So what it emerged in recent studies is that apart from this, the literature has called the local buzz, which is the local transmission of knowledge through person-to-person interaction and firm-to-firm interaction needs to be complemented by some global pipelines where knowledge is brought into a given cluster, and multinationals can play a role in building these clusters, but also in building these pipelines. But also we need ways to create these bridges between places, and I will discuss some implication for policy. The other thing is the fear that if we observe that R&D is related to production, do we have to be afraid that if we lose production, we will lose also the chance to attracting R&D? Well, here there are different views, and again, I'm going kind of giving big brushes, and the reality is probably more complicated than what I'm depicting here. But if there's time to discuss, we will go in more details. But so the key point is that there are advantages from locating R&D close to production. So there is some reason to the point that if one place is not attractive for production investment, that place might also lose the possibility to attract R&D. But there are also arguments that go in the other direction. And one of the arguments is that R&D and production are attracted by different factors. And it is possible to unbundle R&D and production, even though this creates further organizational difficulties. And it is easier when knowledge is more codified, so more easily transferable rather than tacit, because in the case of more tacit knowledge, having R&D and production co-located increases, make things much easier. But the bottom line is that it's not necessarily a given that if a country or a city is losing the attractiveness for production investment, that they will also lose the possibility to attract R&D, because there's a lot of evidence that R&D and production can be disjointed. The last point that I want to make is one about distance, and it's simply the idea that multinationals, when multinationals decide to locate in a certain place, they tend to prefer places which are close to home for a number of reasons, because they are less unfamiliar, they are more familiar, and they are less difficult to coordinate. In the case of R&D, this might not be possible, partly because of the spiky nature of geography that I described. And here is a data from a recent study that I've been involved in, showing that when you look at production investments, when you look at the investment of multinationals between cities, you can see that so between if you compute the distance between the city of the investor and the city of destination of activity, when you look at production investment, this distance is in the region of 5,700 kilometers, and R&D is instead the distance is much longer, so it's in the region of 2,000 kilometers more. Well, what this tells us is that firms go much further away when they look at to locate their R&D investment. So in this case, in a sense, if we are an investment attraction agency, that also means that we can look much further away from our country to find potential investors, for example, into Sweden. So let me conclude with some implication for policy here. The first thing is that, my view here is that the locus of industrial policy relies on a combination of national and local intervention. So on the one hand, intellectual property rights and tax rates are important, but when we think of policies to attract R&D investment by multinationals, we also have to think at policies that operate at a very granular geographical scale, such as the city or the city region. So we have to think at policies, for example, that improve the quality of life in cities to attract talents, because by attracting talents, we will attract multinationals. They want to hire those talents. Attracting multinationals that do R&D, Riccardo Crescenzi and others, they call them innovation catalysts. This can be useful because it might ignite the self-reinforcing process. So as a policy measure, it makes sense to invest some resources on attracting specific investors, because this could spur a process of further innovation. And that also means that in the case of Sweden, for example, the attractiveness of a country as a whole passes through also the attractiveness of individual cities. So strong city regions such as Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö are also a part of the attractiveness of Sweden as a whole. Last slide is the idea that when we think of attracting multinationals, we should also think of policies that facilitate connections between these narrowly defined places with other places which are located worldwide. And that means that we need to find ways to create this global pipelines or global connections. And in this way, in this line of thought, for example, mobility of inventors and entrepreneurs, or the role of ethnic communities and migrants is crucial. So policies of open borders, which we might think have nothing to do with this, but instead might be very relevant when we think of making a place more attractive for our investments of multinationals. And the last thing is that we don't have to be discouraged by the fact that our places are not attracting for production investments, because they could still attract R&D activities. And what I might say here is that, of course, we need to look at specific industries where the knowledge base is more codified, and the specific firms which are able to decouple production and R&D. So this might be the more advanced multinationals, but it's still possible. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, David. Two very quick questions. We're short on time here, but very, very quick questions. We have a policy audience, and when you talk about building bridges between places and making linkages, have you examples where policymakers are successfully doing this? How do you go about building those connections? You mentioned, as an example, you've emphasized taxes and access to human capital. Is there a trade-off? If you have a bad tax system, high tax rates, can you compensate by having a lot of human capital? Or is there no such trade-off where you fail at one area and you actually lose out on investments? Two very quick questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Johan. Yeah, very, very good point. And of course, it would take all day probably to answer them in full. And there are certainly areas for investigations because we need more evidence-based policy making. And so I will give you some of my thought, but of course, these are not necessarily based on research, and they are not. You have to take them with a grain of salt, in a sense. But well, there is a trade-off. I'm starting from the last point. There's a trade-off between any policy, of course, because governments and national governments and local governments have a finite amount of resources, and so they have to choose where to put their in which basket they put their money. And what I think what my research has shown is that when you look at specifically attracting R&D activities for multinationals, the return from putting money into having a more talented workforce, a more attractive city is probably worth more than lowering your tax rate. But of course, there are exceptions, and by attracting, if you spend your money to attract a multinational, you might hope that could spur a process of spillover or externality for the local economy. So, and this would attract other firms, attract other talents. So, in a sense, also spending your money in subsidies sometimes or attraction packages for multinationals could be effective, because this could initiate a process where more talented workers move to a certain place because they want to work for a multinational, and other firms move there for similar reason because they want to interact with that firm. So it's difficult to answer, but in my research, what I came across is that as soon as you control for the local factors, most of the time it turns out that low taxes is not such an important policy measure. But in a sense, it is easier lower taxes as a policy than to do all sort of other things. And this comes to your first point. How do we create bridges and then create connection between places? That is a very tough question. When I thought about this in writing the report, I thought that, for example, policies that constrain the mobility of people or that make the mobility of people more difficult in general also have an indirect effect of making that place less connected. And if the connection between places is important to attract high value-added activities, this might kind of fire back. So, but that opens a big debate. And what are the actual policy tools to do that? This is a very complicated question that deserve a proper and well documented debate, I think.
Yeah, that might be a topic for a coming report then. Thank you very much, David. Now to the final chapter of today, Fredrik Sjöholm. You're also going to talk about foreign direct investments and perhaps from a slightly Swedish perspective, and hopefully you can give us your view of how Sweden is doing in attracting investments. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Johan, and thank you, David, for excellent paper and excellent presentation. And I do think that my paper complements David's work by not having a focus on R&D and by talking a little bit about Sweden and how foreign direct investment into Sweden looks like. I think the first thing one should note when we talk about the FDI is that it is not increasing anymore. Okay, so for a long time there was a very strong growth in foreign direct investment, stronger than we saw in international trade, for instance. But since, let's say, the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, there's been stagnation, perhaps even a decline. I mean, certainly during the pandemic, which is not so strange, but the trend really started before. One of the reasons is that there's a different sets of policy being introduced. Whereas in the 1990s, everyone kind of liberalized the foreign direct investment regimes. After the financial crisis, there are more and more policies that actually restrict the entrance of foreign firms into the country. So there's certainly a change in attitude towards FDI. The question then is this a problem? Well, I would say so, because there are some relatively large benefits to the host economy from having foreign firms entering the country. It's not that they are foreign by itself. It's not that they are multinational by itself. It is that multinational firms tend to be strong firms with high levels of productivity. Okay? They couldn't become multinationals if they didn't have high levels of productivity, because it's costly, it's complicated to invest in other countries. So it's only the best firms that becomes multinationals. By having these firms coming into Sweden, for instance, we get higher levels of productivity, increase output, increase incomes. People working for multinationals have higher salaries than people working for local firms. So there are benefits to the host economy. That's the main reason why we are interested in this. There are also other advantages. And for instance, one of the really key characteristics of multinational firms during the last decades is that they have been superbly good at dividing up the value-added chain and then put different parts of production in different countries. And if you get kind of linked up to this value change, you can really expand and boost production. There's a lot of evidence of that. So that's one advantage. It really gives you a boost by being linked up to the global economy. And also, there are a lot of talks in the literature about the externalities, that when you have these foreign multinationals coming into Sweden, for instance, some of the technology will leak out, some of the employees at these multinational firms, they will join a local firm instead, bringing the knowledge with them. Or you have support of linkages or support of other firms in the local economy. So there are definitely different advantages of having these firms coming into the country. And the question then, which I discuss in this paper, is, okay, what are the key characteristics? How do we get multinationals to come into a country? And I do that by really surveying the scientific literature and try to identify what are the main determinants to foreign direct investments. In other words, when you have a multinational firms in US or in Germany or whatever, and who is thinking about where to invest, what are the key characteristics, the key country characteristics that these multinational firms take into account when they make the decision? And I think when surveying this existing literature, a few things comes out as clearly more important than other stuff. And one of those is stability. Multinational firms, they shy away from instability. And there are good reasons for that. I mean, these are typically large investments that are long-term. And you want to avoid all types of uncertainties. So economic and political stability is among the most important. Second, I would say skilled labor force. It comes out in almost all studies, empirical studies on FDI, that the skilled labor force is very good. It depends, of course, a little bit on what type of FDI we're talking about. But if you look at a country like Sweden, trying to attract relatively sophisticated firms, skilled labor force is very, very important. Thirdly, good infrastructure often comes out as important. And of course, infrastructure is a very broad concept. Here in particular, it seems to be things that enable firms to trade easily. So we're talking about airports, we're talking about harbors and the like. And that again is for good reasons. I mean, multinational firms are more what we call trade intensive. They import a lot of their inputs and they export a lot of their outputs. So this type of infrastructure is very, very important. And that relates also to the trade regime. An open trade regime is important if you want to have multinational firms coming into your country. Taxes, and that has been discussed by David, and I think I agree that taxes is important, but it's more like you cannot deviate too much from the taxes in neighboring countries, okay? And taxes in itself will not compensate if the other basics are bad, okay? So it's more like if you have a firm, thinking about whether they should invest in a bunch of similar countries, then taxes becomes important. But it cannot compensate for other stuff. And one example of this is actually President Trump, who cut corporate taxes from, if I recall it correctly, from 35% to 21, 22 something. But in the same time, FDI went down. Why? Well, he also kind of increased tariffs on imports from Europe and imports from China and so forth. So it couldn't compensate this poorer trade policy. What I take with me from the literature, from doing this, what really kind of struck me was that, well, one, it's the basics. Is it industrial policy? Well, we have talked about that before. It depends on how you define industrial policies. But two, and this is important, these are the same factors that will benefit local firms. Okay? So if you pursue good policies for local firms, you will also increase inflows of multinational firms. So that's kind of make it easier, I think, for policymakers. So how do Sweden do in terms of these basics? Well, stability, certainly. Political stability. There's no military coup in Sweden, and there's not even big changes, I would say, in economic policies and the like. So there's been a large degree of political stability and a large degree of economic stability. Since the financial crisis in the early 1990s, growth has been stable and pretty high. Inflation has been low. The public finances are in good shape, budget deficits, public debt, and so forth. So economic stability, political stability, that's there. Open trade regime. Well, the trade regime today is, of course, determined at the European Union level. It has been open, but I think this is one of the areas where we need to keep our eyes on, because there are definitely trends now towards more protectionism. I think Nina discussed that a little bit before about European Union industrial policy. If you read that, there's a lot of discussions and a lot of talk about autonomy. What is autonomy? Well, that we should, build up our own firms in some key sectors and protect them behind barriers. There is a new wave of screening of foreign direct investments. This is really directed towards China, which we also discussed before. There are, of course, the climate tariffs, that you have tariffs on import of goods that contribute to climate change. So a lot of these policies are, reasonable if you look at them by itself. But it's also a risk that they will be used to kind of for other objects to protect your own industries. I mean, if you give all these instruments to, let's say, French bureaucrats, you can be pretty sure that they're going to use it for protectionistic measures to protect their own industries. So I think we need to keep our eyes on how the trade regime develops in the European Union in the coming years. And for that reason, it's really sad that Great Britain left the European Union, because they tend to be, like Sweden, in favor of free trade. Quality of education is probably the most problematic areas for Sweden. As we all know, the quality of education, the quality of all levels of education has deteriorated in Sweden, from primary school to university. There are signs that maybe the fall has at least stopped now, but it would take probably a long time before we are back where we were maybe 20, 25 years ago. And that is, of course, that's bad for attracting foreign direct investments, but the real cost is, of course, for young people who will have to compete in the future with low wages rather than with high skills. Infrastructure, there are some areas where there's a need for more investment in infrastructure. I think when you talk to firms, whether that's multinational firms, foreign firms, or local firms, electricity is a big issue, and that was something that came out also in the discussion in the panel previously. The electricity firms are concerned whether they will have a steady and reliable supply of electricity. So there's a need for work in that area. And then taxes. Taxes have declined in Sweden quite a lot in the last decades as a share of GDP, but they're still among the highest in OECD countries. If you look at capital taxes, I think that's the fourth highest or something like that. I would say that capital taxes are probably not the most important taxes here if you want to attract foreign firms. Why? Well, one reason is that multinationals are so good at avoiding them. Okay, so they use transfer pricing to show profits in countries where taxes are low. But I think if you look at the income taxes, they're also relatively high in Sweden, and that could be an obstacle for some types of foreign direct investment, especially since many of them bring expats to Sweden. And although we have a reduction in taxes, it's temporary. Okay, so these are the basics. Then there are, these are the things that will have a positive effects on local firms as well as multinational firms. Then there are some areas where we might want to focus specifically on multinationals. It's often about knowledge about the country, okay? We can expect that Swedish firms, local firms, know more about laws and regulations and so forth than do foreign firms. And here we have agencies such as, it used to be Invest in Sweden agencies, today we have Business Sweden, that provide help, for instance, to foreign firms that want to establish themselves here. And there are good reasons for doing that, to share information. Also something that comes out from literature is that, efficient procedures, the less red tape, the better. I think Swedish bureaucracy is relatively good, but there's of course always room for improvements. You can look at the experience of some other countries with one-stop shop and so forth. And also, I should say, avoid subsidies. Many countries, even many OECD countries, use subsidies to attract foreign firms to the country. There are very little evidence that should have any positive effect, and often the cost is much higher than the gain to the country. So my advice would be to concentrate on the basics, get the basics right. We're running out of time. Let me say that once you have the foreign firms here, You of course also want them to behave in a beneficial way. Okay, you typically want them to form links with local actors. You want them to bring in sophisticated technologies, and here also I discussed this at some length in the paper. But here to summarize that a lot of this has also to do with general policies, and also perhaps, to try to form clusters, invite multinational firms to industries where we already have a strong supply base and so forth. That seems to be the best policies to achieve this. So I'm running out of time, so let me stop here, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Fredrik. We are indeed running out of time. I have tons of questions for you, and you know that. But what we will do, we still have a few chapters that haven't been discussed here today and presented, and I will invite you for those sessions and give you plenty of time for questions and discussion. With those words, I would like to ask Bo Erik to join for 2 minutes on stage for a very to actually talk about future opportunities to talk and discuss these issues. And I can just give the very brief introduction to that. And Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum has, with the help of, among others, Vinnova, initiated a research project that is going to run over 4 years, looking at competitiveness and the Swedish competitiveness. And it's going to be with close links, but at arm's length with industry. And Bo Erik is the chairman of that task force. So Bo Erik, a few words about that.
I think that is a very, very important work that we are going into here, and regarding what we are doing in the climate change area and so on, with fossil-free production, etc. It's of course also very important for us that we can secure our competitiveness also in the future, so we can be a great example also for other countries. Because of that, I think this work is very, very important, and I must say I look very much forward to continue with this together with you, all the specialists in this area. Definitely.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Bo Erik, and thank you everyone for participating, and also appreciate that you who are still with us online are that. So hope to see you again in future events. Thank you very much. Thanks.